The sky above northern France was burning. Engines screamed through the morning clouds as tracer fire streaked across the horizon. Inside one of those silver P-51 Mustangs, a lone pilot pushed his aircraft beyond every limit written in the manual. His name was Captain Roland Kessler, but among his squadron he was known by another name, the Mad Pilot. He wasn't called that because he lost his mind in the war. He earned it because he flew as if he could see the future, turning chaos into precision, breaking orders that others followed blindly, and somehow surviving when no one else could. That day, over the skies of Caen, Kessler's squadron was on an escort mission. The orders were simple: protect the bombers at all costs, stay in formation, and return home. The officers at command repeated the same rule every morning: discipline saves lives. But discipline had also cost too many of them their friends. At 11,000 feet, the squadron entered enemy territory. Below them, the French countryside looked quiet, almost peaceful. Then out of the sun they came, a swarm of Messerschmitts, their engines howling like wolves closing in on a herd. The radio crackled. "Falcon Squadron enemy fighters, 12 o'clock high. Maintain escort formation." Kessler's eyes narrowed. He could already see the bombers falling into the trap. He knew the Germans would dive straight into their center, cut through the middle, and vanish before the escort fighters could react. It was a slaughter he had seen before, and he wasn't going to watch it happen again. "Falcon 1, breaking formation," he said over the radio. The words froze everyone for a second. "Negative, Falcon 1. Maintain your position." But Kessler was already gone. He rolled his P-51 into a steep dive, ignoring every protocol drilled into his head since training. His aircraft cut through the air like a knife. He came up under the bomber formation, where the Messerschmitts least expected him, and opened fire. The first German fighter burst into flames. The second tried to roll away, but Kessler followed, matching every twist, every drop, as if gravity itself was his ally. "He's breaking orders again," someone shouted over the comms. "He's saving the bombers," another voice replied. The sky turned into chaos, vapor trails crossing, engines roaring, explosions painting the horizon. In the middle of it, Kessler's Mustang danced like it belonged there. He was fearless, not because he wanted glory, but because he trusted his instincts more than the people giving him commands. When the smoke began to clear, 4 enemy fighters were down. The rest fled west, leaving the bombers untouched. The mission was saved. But command wasn't celebrating. When Kessler landed, mechanics ran toward his plane, riddled with holes, smoke still rising from the engine. His men cheered, but the officers didn't. He climbed out of the cockpit, removed his helmet, and waited for what he knew was coming. The base commander approached, face like stone. "Captain Kessler," he said, "you disobeyed direct orders." Kessler wiped oil from his hands. "Yes, sir, I did. You risked every man in your squadron." "And they're all alive, sir." The commander said nothing. The silence stretched until it felt heavier than the sky itself. Finally, he turned away. "You're grounded until further notice." That night, as the others drank to celebrate, Kessler sat alone by his aircraft. The moonlight caught the bullet holes across the fuselage, scars of a fight he wasn't supposed to win. Somewhere in the darkness, he could still hear the echo of that command. Maintain formation. He lit a cigarette, looked at the stars and whispered, "You can't win wars by standing still." He didn't know it yet. But this act of defiance, this single choice to ignore the rules and follow instinct, would define the rest of his life. It would make him a hero to those who flew beside him, and an enemy to the men sitting safely behind desks. Because in a war built on obedience, one man's disobedience had just rewritten the rules of the sky. Long before he became the pilot they called mad, Roland Kessler was just a boy staring at the sky. He grew up on the outskirts of Chicago, in a small town where trains rattled by more often than airplanes. Yet whenever he heard that faint hum of an engine miles above, he would drop everything and look up. To him, flight wasn't just a marvel, it was freedom. While other boys collected baseball cards, Roland built toy planes out of scrap metal and wooden crates. He'd test them from rooftops, watching them crash and scatter, only to gather the pieces again. Every failure made him more obsessed. His father, a mechanic, used to shake his head. "One day you'll either fix engines or blow them up trying." Roland only smiled. He didn't want to fix engines. He wanted to be one. When the war broke out, that dream turned into purpose. He joined the Air Corps not because of duty, but because the sky finally needed him. But from the very first day of training, it was clear he didn't belong to the system. At the flight academy in Texas, discipline ruled everything. Every move, every turn, every climb had to be done by the book. Instructors demanded precision, not passion. But Roland flew differently. He would take sharp climbs when told to level off, cut through turns faster than was safe, and dive when others pulled back. To him, flight was instinct, not instruction. He didn't break the rules to show off. He broke them because the rules couldn't keep up with his mind. One instructor, Captain Miles, once pulled him aside after a training sortie. "You fly like you've got a death wish, Kessler." "No, sir," he replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I fly like I want to live." He was written up for reckless conduct 3 times during training, and yet his scores in tactical exercises were unmatched. He could predict an opponent's turn before it happened, anticipate the sun's glare, and adjust his flight path by instinct, something even veteran pilots struggled with. But in a military world built on obedience, brilliance was dangerous. To some, he was gifted. To others, he was a threat. During one practice dogfight, Kessler pulled a maneuver no one had seen before. Instead of looping around his target, he dove straight into a cloud bank, cut his throttle, vanished from radar, then reappeared behind his opponent's tail. It broke every rule of engagement, and yet it worked flawlessly. His instructors called it reckless improvisation. He called it survival. After the exercise, the base commander wrote in his file, "Highly talented, uncontrollable, dangerous in command structure." The label would follow him for the rest of his career. By the time he graduated, the war in Europe had intensified. The skies were no longer romantic. They were mechanical killing fields. And yet, when Kessler received his posting orders to England, he felt something close to relief. For the first time, he would fly not for practice, but for purpose. Before leaving, one of his instructors stopped him at the gate. "You're good, Kessler," he said, "but good pilots follow orders." Roland looked up at the roaring transport plane waiting for him and replied, "Maybe that's why so many of them die. It wasn't arrogance. It was clarity, the kind that only comes from knowing your limits and daring to cross them." When he arrived at the airbase in southern England, his reputation had already preceded him. The ground crews whispered, "That's the one they called mad in training." He ignored it. To him, the nickname wasn't an insult, it was prophecy. He wasn't there to follow orders. He was there to survive, and to make sure others did too, even if it meant defying every rule written by men who had never touched the clouds. And as his boots touched the muddy runway for the first time, he looked at the distant hangars filled with worn-out planes and whispered to himself, "Let's see what madness can really do." No one knew it yet, but the boy who once built broken toy planes was about to rewrite the physics of air combat. The birth of a maverick had begun, and the war would never be the same again. Southern England, 1943. The air smelled of fuel, metal, and fear. The war in the skies was reaching its boiling point, and the Luftwaffe ruled the daylight. Allied bombers vanished into smoke, their formations shattered before they even reached the target. And into this storm walked a man they called Mad. Lieutenant Roland Kessler, newly assigned to the 42nd Fighter Squadron, stepped off the transport truck and stared at the runway. Lined up in the mist were the P-47 Thunderbolts, big, heavy, and outdated by the standards of what they were facing. Across the channel, the Germans were flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, faster, sharper, and deadlier. But Kessler didn't care. He never blamed machines for losing battles. He blamed the men who flew them without imagination. The first briefing came at dawn. The commanding officer, Colonel Briggs, stood over a map covered in red arrows and cigarette ash. "Gentlemen, your job is to protect the bombers. Stay in formation. Stay disciplined. No lone heroics." He said it while staring directly at Kessler, as if the warning was made for him. Kessler simply nodded, but behind his calm eyes was calculation. He'd studied the Luftwaffe's attack patterns. The Germans didn't fight fair. They didn't come head-on. They attacked from the sun, diving at steep angles, scattering the formation and picking off stragglers one by one. And yet, Allied command kept sending squadrons in perfect box formations, predictable, slow and suicidal. When the first mission came, Kessler saw the disaster unfold exactly as he had imagined, 1,000 feet over France. A sky of blue turning red, bombers in formation flying straight into the waiting jaws of the Luftwaffe. From above, German fighters screamed down like hawks. Tracer fire streaked the clouds. Engines exploded. Parachutes bloomed too late. Kessler gripped his control stick tighter. "Command says hold formation," his wingman shouted over the radio. "If we hold formation," Kessler snapped, "we'll hold our funeral next." He broke away, ignoring the order completely. His thunderbolt tilted into a steep dive, the G-forces pressing his chest, the sky spinning around him in blue and fire. The radio filled with chaos, officers yelling, men screaming. But Kessler was already moving faster than their words. He cut across the path of a German FWI-190, chasing a bomber, pulling a maneuver so sharp the wings shuddered. The enemy pilot overshot, confused, and in that half-second of hesitation, Kessler rolled under and fired. The cannon burst, tore through the Luftwaffe's fuselage. One down, but he wasn't done. He climbed again, straight into the sun. His plane disappeared into blinding light, and when he re-emerged, 2 more Germans were already in his sights. 3 bursts, 2 kills. When sky regained, from the ground, observers saw what looked like madness. A lone thunderbolt darting through clouds, cutting impossible angles, diving through enemy lines as if gravity didn't apply. From above, it looked like choreography, chaos turned into art. The bombers made it home that day. Half of them would have been gone without him, but at base the mood was not celebratory. When Kessler landed, the commander was waiting on the tarmac, arms crossed, eyes cold. "You disobeyed a direct order, Lieutenant." "Yes, sir." "And we brought all 12 bombers home?" "That's not the point. That's exactly the point." The room fell silent. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply spoke the truth no one wanted to admit, that sometimes survival meant disobedience. That night, while the others celebrated in the mess hall, Kessler sat alone in the hangar, wiping the soot off his plane's nose. The metal still burned warm from flight. He ran his hand over the scratches and bullet holes, whispering, "We're not done yet, old girl." He looked toward the dark runway stretching into the clouds. He knew the battles ahead would be worse. The Luftwaffe was learning. The missions would get bloodier, but he also knew something else, something that would change air combat forever. The enemy didn't fear the planes. They feared the pilots who refused to fly like everyone else, and soon Kessler would give them a new reason to fear. A maneuver so bold, so dangerous, that it would be banned by command, yet remembered by every pilot who ever dared to fly beyond the rules. The radio crackled inside the cramped cockpit. "Pull back immediately." "That's an order." But the pilot didn't respond. His gloved hands tightened around the control stick. The sweat on his brow mixed with engine oil, and the roar of the propellers drowned out every ounce of doubt inside him. Below, the battlefield was chaos. Tracer fire streaking across the clouds. Enemy fighters circling like hawks waiting for the kill. Command wanted him out. They'd already lost 3 planes. But he wasn't ready to run. Not when his brothers in arms were still down there calling for cover. The voice came again, harsher this time. "Mad One, do you copy?" "You're outnumbered. Return to base." He gritted his teeth. "Not yet," he muttered, more to himself than the man on the other end. Then he slammed the throttle forward. The aircraft groaned as it dove through the smoke. His plane wasn't built for this. It was sluggish, old, a relic compared to the sleek enemy machines. But he had something they didn't: rage, instinct, an absolute refusal to die quietly. The ground rushed closer. Explosions tore through the clouds as he spotted a squad of friendly bombers pinned under anti-air fire. Command had written them off already, but not him. He swooped down low, cutting through enemy lines. Bullets shredded his wings, but he didn't flinch. He'd lined up his sights. 1, 2, 3 bursts, and the skies lit up. 2 enemy fighters went down in flames, spiraling toward the earth. The rest scattered. For a few seconds everything was quiet again. Only the sound of his damaged engine filled the void. Then he heard the cheers. "Mad one, you did it! You cleared the corridor." He didn't reply. His focus was on the smoke trail curling from his right wing. He knew he wouldn't make it back. But that didn't matter. He'd done what command said couldn't be done. Back at headquarters, they were silent. The colonel watched his radar screen, eyes fixed on the single blip moving away from the target zone. Slower now, fading. The operator looked up. "Should we send recovery?" The colonel exhaled. He disobeyed every direct order, but he saved the entire squadron. Silence hung in the air. The colonel reached for the radio. "Mad one, this is command. You're clear to come home." Static. Then faintly, a laugh. "Copy that, command." But home might be a little farther than you think. He barely made it over the ridge before the engine gave out. Smoke poured into the cockpit, and he yanked the canopy open, wind tearing at his face. With a final pull, he ejected, watching his plane, his partner through dozens of missions, spiral into the clouds below. When he hit the ground, the world was quiet. No orders, no ranks, no radios, just the sound of distant thunder, or maybe artillery. He'd done the impossible, but the price was isolation. The next morning, reports flooded in. Enemy retreat confirmed. Bomber squad survived. Lone pilot missing in action. At headquarters, his name was erased from the flight log. The official report said he failed to follow protocol. But among the men who'd seen the sky that day, a legend was born. The pilot who defied orders, saved lives, and vanished into history. They called him mad. But sometimes madness is just courage that command can't understand. He was alive, barely. The crash had torn through his body like a storm, leaving him bruised, burned, and half-conscious among the twisted metal of his own aircraft. The jungle around him was silent, except for the slow drip of oil and the crackle of a dying engine. He crawled out, dragging one leg that no longer obeyed him. Smoke rose into the grey sky like a signal flare, a beacon that could bring rescue. Or death. He didn't care anymore. He had done what he came to do. The bombers were safe. His men were alive. That was enough. But command didn't see it that way. Back at base, his name wasn't being written into any medal lists. It was being written into a court-martial file. Charge: direct disobedience of combat orders. Result: pending review by High Command. When the recovery team found him 3 days later, he was more ghost than man. They loaded him into a stretcher, not with honor, but with suspicion. No handshakes, no salutes, only silence. The officers didn't even look him in the eye as they walked him through the hallway toward the hearing chamber. He wasn't captain anymore. He wasn't sir. He was the pilot who went rogue. Inside, a long table gleamed under fluorescent lights. The men seated there weren't soldiers of the sky. They were bureaucrats of war. Polished shoes, cold eyes, empty hearts. The colonel who once praised him now read his violations aloud, line by line. "You disobeyed a direct withdrawal command. You risked 6 aircraft under your command. You compromised base communication channels." He said nothing. He just stared at his bandaged hands, the same hands that had saved an entire squadron from annihilation. One of the younger officers spoke up quietly. "Sir, with respect, his actions did save lives." The room fell silent. The colonel's eyes snapped toward him. "This court isn't about what was saved, Lieutenant. It's about what was broken. Discipline. Discipline. That was their God. The only thing sacred in the machinery of war." He wanted to scream, to tell them what it felt like up there, when the radio turned to static and every decision meant life or death. But he knew it was useless. They weren't there. They'd never hear the thunder, never smell the burning oil, never see men die for orders written by men who never flew. Finally, the colonel leaned forward. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, pilot?" He met their eyes. For the first time he spoke, voice calm, quiet, but sharp as steel. "Yes, I do," he paused. "I followed the only order that mattered, to protect my men." The colonel's jaw tightened. "At the cost of your command?" "At the cost of everything," he replied. A murmur rippled through the room. Some were angry, others ashamed. In that moment they all knew. They were punishing a man for doing what they couldn't, for making a choice too human, for a system that had forgotten humanity. The verdict was swift, suspended indefinitely, stripped of honors. Grounded from active duty, they thought they'd buried him. Another rebel pilot silenced by paperwork, but outside in the hangars, whispers began to spread among the crews. "He saved us. He went back when command said it was hopeless. Maybe he wasn't mad after all." They started calling him by a new name, not Mad One, not Captain, just the pilot, the one who did what others wouldn't. That night, as he packed his things, a familiar voice called from the doorway. The lieutenant, the same one who spoke in his defense, stood there, cap in hand. "Sir," he said softly, "you changed the way we fly." "They'll never admit it, but you did," he smiled faintly. "Then it was worth it." When he walked out of the base for the last time, the runway lights were dim. The sound of engines still echoed in the distance, a world moving on without him. But somewhere deep inside, he knew. History has a way of remembering the mad ones, and one day, long after the uniforms and medals have turned to dust, someone would tell his story, not as a tale of rebellion, but of courage that defied command. The war was eating itself alive. By the summer of 1944, the Allied advance had slowed to a crawl. Every gain was paid for in blood and steel. The skies were filled with smoke trails and falling wrecks, the grim handwriting of a world tearing itself apart. The pilot they once called mad sat alone in the mechanic bay of an airfield somewhere in England. He was grounded, forgotten, and officially under review. But that didn't stop him from staring at the sky every morning. Watching the formations lift off without him, he could hear the engines roar, smell the fuel, feel the vibration in his chest. Every takeoff was a reminder. The war was still raging, and he was chained to the ground. Then came the operation. A coded order arrived at the base. Operation Iron Veil. It was a mission no one wanted, a deep strike across occupied France to take out a heavily fortified German radar network that was shredding Allied bombers mid-air. Dozens of missions had failed. Squadrons wiped out. Every pilot who tried either vanished or returned broken. When the briefing ended, the room fell silent. No one volunteered until a quiet voice broke through. "I'll go." Heads turned. It was him, the suspended pilot still wearing the patch of the unit that had disowned him. The colonel's face went pale. "You don't even have authorization to fly," he shrugged. "Then you can call it another act of madness." They didn't stop him. Maybe because deep down they knew he was the only one reckless enough or brilliant enough to pull it off. That night, under the dim lights of the hangar, he climbed into his old fighter, the same one he'd rebuilt with his own hands. Mechanics whispered prayers. Ground crew watched in silence. When the engine roared to life, it sounded less like a machine and more like vengeance. He took off at 400 hours, cutting through the fog over the channel. Below him, the world was nothing but shadows and silver waves. Ahead, enemy airspace. The mission was suicide. But he wasn't flying for orders anymore. He was flying for the men who never came back. By dawn, German radar had already picked up his approach. Searchlights cut through the clouds. Flak bursts painted the sky. Every explosion shook the cockpit, rattling his bones, but he didn't flinch. He dove lower, closer to the treetops, almost skimming the earth. The altimeter screamed. Any lower, and he'd plow into the ground. But that's exactly what he wanted. He was invisible now, Too low for radar, too fast for their guns. This was his madness, a flight pattern so unpredictable it broke every manual, every training doctrine. But it worked. He slipped past their defenses like a ghost, weaving between tracer rounds that tore the air behind him. The target appeared, a cluster of steel towers glowing faintly in the early light. The German radar hub. He armed his payload and climbed sharply, straight into the heart of enemy fire. The radio crackled, panicked voices from Allied HQ. "Abort mission!" "You'll never make it out." He didn't answer. Instead, he whispered to himself, "If I don't, they will." He dropped the bombs at near point-blank range. The shockwave ripped through the air, blinding light bursting across the horizon. His plane bucked violently, metal screaming under the force. He pulled the throttle, trying to climb out, but the engine coughed, sputtered, and died. A piece of shrapnel had torn through the fuel line. For a few seconds, gravity reclaimed him. The ground rushed up, but he leveled out just enough to glide toward open fields. The crash was brutal. The world turned to fire and silence. When the smoke cleared, the radar station was gone. The entire German defense grid in that region offline. Allied bombers that had been trapped in enemy fire were now flying freely, unhunted. Thousands of lives saved. One pilot missing, hours later his name spread through the airwaves like wildfire. Pilots in the sky were repeating it, like a code word for hope. He did it. He actually did it. The madman pulled it off. At HQ, the colonel stood staring at the mission map, the one that had always been marked with failure after failure. Now, for the first time, it was marked successful. He didn't say a word. But in that silence, he knew the man they'd tried to silence had just changed the course of the air war. Days later, reconnaissance photos confirmed what no one believed possible. The German radar complex was reduced to ash. And though wreckage was found, there was no body. Some said he died in the explosion. Others claimed he'd been captured or vanished behind enemy lines. But among the pilots, a different story took root. They said that sometimes, when the clouds were thick and the radios filled with static, you could still hear his voice, calm, steady, guiding them through the fire. He became more than a man. He became a signal, a reminder that courage doesn't need permission, and for those who flew after him, the message was clear. Sometimes you have to break the rules to save the world. For weeks, the wreckage lay silent in the fields of northern France, a burned-out shell of twisted metal and shattered wings. To the Germans, it was just another downed Allied fighter. But to the Allied command, it was a mystery. No body, no pilot. Only fragments of the aircraft's fuselage and a single, still functioning flight recorder. When engineers recovered the black box, they expected chaos, random maneuvers, reckless flying, a pattern that proved the pilot had truly lost control. What they found instead changed everything. The data wasn't chaos. It was calculation. Each roll, each dive, each shift in throttle followed a pattern, an invisible rhythm synchronized with something much larger, the environment itself. Wind currents, sun angles, radar reflections, and even the enemy's radio chatter, all had been woven together like a living equation. It wasn't madness. It was strategy, a hidden science of survival. In a dimly lit war room, intelligence officers gathered around a table covered in maps and blueprints. A radar specialist pointed at the reconstructed flight path. "Look here," he said, tapping the red line that zigzagged across the chart. He wasn't running from radar. He was dancing with it. The others stared, confused. Every time German radar tried to lock onto him, the officer continued, he dropped altitude, just enough to blend with the static interference from ground clutter. It's almost like he knew how their radar pulse delay worked. Another technician leaned in. But how would a pilot know that? That's classified engineering data. Silence filled the room. Until one man finally said what they were all thinking because he studied it. Before his suspension, the mad pilot had spent nights alone in the base hangar, poring over maintenance manuals and radar diagrams. Mechanics remembered seeing him draw strange sketches, arcs, loops, and spirals that looked more like art than flight plans. When asked what he was doing, he'd just say, "Trying to understand how the sky thinks." To him, flying wasn't just reaction, it was conversation. The wind spoke, the clouds whispered. The sun blinded both man and machine in equal measure. He listened, learned, and turned those whispers into a new language of flight. He'd noticed something most pilots missed. German radar systems of that era had a blind pulse window, a tiny fraction of a second between transmissions when the system couldn't track targets. No one thought it mattered. But to him, that fraction was everything. He built his entire flying method around exploiting that heartbeat of invisibility. That's why his movements seemed erratic. Dives, climbs, sharp turns that defied logic. But behind every move was timing so precise it bordered on impossible. He could make a whole squadron vanish on radar, not by magic, but by math. Reports began circulating through Allied intelligence. At first they called it the rogue pattern. Then someone renamed it the mad loop. The name spread through squadrons like wildfire. Young pilots tried to imitate it, looping and rolling through training exercises, often blacking out from the G-forces. Few could pull it off. It wasn't just skill, it was intuition. His intuition. A surviving wingman from one of his earlier missions was brought in for debriefing. He sat across from the officers, hands trembling slightly as he recalled that final flight. "You have to understand," he said. He never looked scared, not once. Even when the sky was falling apart around us. He just knew where to be. One of the officers asked. The pilot nodded. He'd move before the enemy even fired. It was like he could feel the bullets coming before they left the gun. No one laughed. No one doubted him, because they'd seen the combat footage. Tracer rounds slicing through empty air where his plane should have been, but wasn't. Weeks turned into months. The pilot's status remained officially missing in action, but among the high command, something had shifted. His techniques, once branded reckless, were now being studied, mapped, and quietly integrated into Allied combat training manuals. They realized he had rewritten the principles of dogfighting without ever intending to. Traditional doctrine taught predictability, formation, hierarchy, control. He taught adaptability, freedom, instinct, chaos turned into art. His greatest secret wasn't just how he flew. It was why he flew that way. He believed that survival in the sky wasn't about following rules, but about rewriting them mid-air. Every split-second choice, climb, dive, roll, wasn't disobedience. It was reading the enemy's heartbeat and answering with his own. A young strategist from Air Command wrote a report titled The Unorthodox Doctrine. Inside were the pilot's reconstructed maneuvers, annotated with scientific explanation. One line stood out. What command dismissed as madness was in truth foresight. He understood that the sky rewards no one who hesitates. That report circulated through secret channels. No official recognition, no medals. But behind closed doors, commanders began to train elite units using modified versions of his techniques. They never used his name publicly, but within those units, he was legend, the mad one who flew with reason. Years later, long after the war ended, a historian studying declassified records discovered fragments of that same report. He cross-referenced it with post-war pilot interviews and radar data. What he found confirmed what few had suspected. The pilot's so-called insane flight path had predated by years the evasive combat techniques later adopted in jet-age warfare. His instinctive understanding of radar physics was something most nations didn't formally teach until the 1960s. He had seen the future of air combat before anyone else. The truth was simple. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't trying to defy command. He was trying to survive, and in doing so, he'd uncovered the blueprint for a new kind of pilot, not one who followed orders blindly, but one who could think faster than the sky could kill. And though history may have forgotten his name, every modern maneuver, every radar dodge, Every evasive dive that saves a pilot today still carries the fingerprint of the man they once called mad. It began quietly, no medals, no speeches, no parades. Just a handful of engineers and flight instructors gathered around a projector screen, watching the recovered combat footage, frame by frame. In those flickering black and white images, a single plane danced through enemy fire like it was born from the chaos itself. To most, it looked like luck. To those who studied the frames closely, it looked like genius. The same pilot who had once been branded reckless, disobedient, and mad was now being studied by the very men who'd sentenced him to silence. Weeks passed. Reports turned into theories. Theories became experiments. And soon, the unthinkable happened. Allied command called for a full review of his flight data. Inside a hidden hangar in southern England, test pilots and strategists gathered to recreate his maneuvers. They used chalk on the floor, paper on the walls, and memory as their guide. One instructor, a man who had once testified against him at his court-martial, stood silently as a young officer traced a new flight pattern across the blackboard. It was elegant, dangerous, perfect. He used a split-second reverse roll here, the officer said, against all rules of engagement, but it forces the enemy to overshoot every time. The instructor nodded slowly. That's not madness, he whispered. That's evolution. The transformation began from the bottom up. Squadron leaders started testing the mad loop during training exercises. At first, they didn't even call it by his name. Officially, it was referred to as Adaptive Evasive Maneuver Type B. But among the pilots, everyone knew where it came from. They whispered his legend like a secret prayer before missions. Remember the mad one. Fly free, not by the book. Trust your instinct, not the order. By autumn, the new techniques were rewriting Allied air combat strategy. Missions that once ended in disaster were suddenly succeeding. Entire bomber formations began surviving attacks that should have torn them apart. Enemy kill ratios started to shift, not because of better planes, but because of better thinking. Instructors taught recruits how to read wind currents, how to time dives between radar sweeps, how to attack from sun glare. All lessons born from the pilot's forgotten notes. A phrase began circulating through the bases. He didn't break the rules. He proved they were too small. Command couldn't ignore it anymore. A formal review board, assembled under Air Marshal Kent's supervision. Piles of combat data were laid out. Reports, on-camera footage, eyewitness accounts. For 2 hours, the room stayed silent as one young analyst, no older than 25, explained the science behind what the mad pilot had done. He concluded with a single line that would later define a generation of pilots. He saw combat not as chaos, but as pattern. That line became the foundation of the new doctrine of adaptive aerial combat, a set of principles that would shape air warfare for decades. The irony, it was built entirely upon the instincts of a man who never lived to see it. The official documents never mentioned his name. Not once. The committee described the discoveries as collective tactical advancement, but among the few who knew the truth, it was impossible to ignore the ghost behind the words. In the mess halls, in training grounds, in cockpit briefings, his spirit lingered. Pilots taped small notes on their dashboards. Fly mad. A few painted spirals on their wings, a secret tribute to the forbidden maneuver that had once been court-martialed. And then, something extraordinary happened. During a joint operation in 1945, a young pilot performed the exact same maneuver, the same impossible dive through flak, and not only survived, but turned the tide of the mission. When he landed, commanders rushed to congratulate him. Brilliant flying! Who taught you that? The young man smiled faintly. No one. Just something I'd heard from the others. About a pilot who broke the rules. The colonel paused. You mean him? The pilot nodded. They said he was crazy. The colonel stared at the smoking horizon. Maybe so. But the sky seems to remember him. As months passed, the doctrine spread beyond borders. Allied partners, British, Canadian, Australian, and American, all began adapting the new system. Flight manuals were rewritten. Simulator programs incorporated unorthodox predictive motion, a phrase that tried but failed to capture what he'd done by instinct. He had changed more than combat. He had changed thinking. Before him, flying was obedience. After him, flying became art. Years later, during the early days of the jet age, test pilots unknowingly used his same principles to handle supersonic turbulence and radar evasion. Even classified NASA pilot training programs in the 1960s cited weighty adaptive maneuver data, fragments traced back to that one nameless pilot's final mission. He had vanished into myth, but his fingerprints were everywhere, from fighter schools to spaceflight design. In time, military historians began to connect the dots. One of them, Professor Richard Hensley, wrote in his 1972 paper, Doctrine of the Unknown. History often credits institutions, not individuals. But sometimes, one man's defiance writes the rules for those who come after. By the end of the war, the commanders who once judged him were long gone. New generals took their place, men who grew up studying his tactics without even knowing his name, and somewhere in a dusty archive, locked away in a forgotten drawer, his file still read, Pilot status missing in action, verdict, insubordination. But outside, in the open air where propellers still roared and pilots still dreamed, another truth whispered through generations. He didn't disobey orders. He just heard the sky before anyone else. He had changed doctrine. He had changed history. And he had done it without ever being thanked. For years, his name was nothing more than a whisper, buried under official reports, sealed orders, and the quiet shame of disobedience. The pilot who had once ruled the skies, who had stared down enemy formations alone, had vanished from the record books as if he'd never existed. His medals were gone, his uniform boxed away. Only the veterans remembered, the ones who had seen his aircraft break formation that day, disappearing into the sun to do what no one else dared. Time, however, has a way of softening judgment. As the war ended and the dust of history settled, files once hidden began to resurface. In one of them, a faded photograph showed a pilot standing by his plane, helmet under arm, grin wild and defiant. Someone, an old intelligence officer perhaps, had scrawled in the margin, "The madman who saved us." That single line started it all. Journalists, historians, and surviving squadmates began piecing together the fragments of his story. How he broke formation that day, how he ignored the recall command, and how, by pure instinct and courage, he destroyed the enemy squadron before they reached the Allied bombers. It was an act of insubordination that saved hundreds of lives and changed how air combat would be fought thereafter. Still, official recognition was slow to come. In military halls, bravery without obedience is a paradox. Commanders debated for years. Was he a hero or a liability? A visionary or a reckless pilot who got lucky? By the time the Medals Committee reached a decision, the man himself was gone. He'd disappeared into civilian life, working odd jobs in quiet towns, sometimes as a mechanic, sometimes as a flying instructor. He never spoke of the war, never boasted of the day that made him a ghost and a legend all at once. Those who met him later described him as calm, distant, haunted. There was something in his eyes, a look that said he'd seen the edge of the world and didn't like what stared back. He never blamed anyone for what happened. He knew what he'd done, and that was enough. Then, years later, came the ceremony. A quiet one, no television cameras, no grand speeches. Just a few veterans, a folded flag, and a letter delivered by hand. Inside, the government finally admitted what they'd known all along, for extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and for actions that altered the course of air warfare. The medal that should have been pinned to his chest was placed on his gravestone instead. His family stood in silence as the wind moved through the grass. Nearby, a young pilot, barely 20, saluted. He had read about the mad pilot in training school, about how he'd invented new air combat maneuvers on instinct. The instructors still taught them without ever mentioning his name. Now at last, the name had returned. The recognition came, but only in shadows. Posthumous, quiet, almost reluctant. No headlines, no fanfare, just truth, finding its way through the cracks of time. Historians would later call him the father of modern dogfighting. His aerial tactics, born from desperation and intuition, became standard in fighter training manuals across the world. The same maneuvers that once broke orders now formed the backbone of air superiority doctrine. In the end, perhaps that was the real recognition. Not the medal, not the salute, but the knowledge that his instincts had outlived him, that his defiance had become discipline, that the madness the world once condemned was simply vision, too early for its time. As the sun dipped below the runway horizon, casting long shadows over his old base, it felt as if he was still up there somewhere, cutting through the clouds, chasing the impossible. Decades later, the sound of roaring engines still echoes across air bases. Modern jets tearing through the same sky he once ruled. But buried beneath the thunder, in the rhythm of each sharp turn, each evasive roll, lies the ghost of a man the world nearly forgot. The mad pilot, a rebel who broke command, to rewrite command itself. Today, his name rests quietly in the archives of Air Force history, no longer stamped classified. His combat records, once dismissed as reckless improvisations, are now used as teaching material in elite flight schools. Flight instructors point to his old diagrams, tracing invisible arcs in the air, explaining how his forbidden maneuver became the foundation of modern dogfighting. Students listen in silence, their eyes wide. They're told about how one man, driven by instinct and defiance, discovered what no textbook could teach, how to survive chaos when rules no longer apply. Some of them smile when they hear his nickname. They don't laugh at it anymore. They wear it with pride. Madness, one cadet once said, is just courage without permission. In hangars and museums, his plane, restored from fragments, is displayed behind glass. Its wings are dented, the cockpit canopy scarred by years of battle, but there's a strange beauty in it. Visitors pause, reading the small inscription on the plaque beneath. In memory of the pilot who dared to think differently. There's no mention of his disobedience, no details of the trial or the suspension, just his name and a quote engraved in brass. If you want to change the sky, first you must break formation. Historians debate whether he ever realized how much he changed aviation. Some say he lived long enough to see jet fighters take to the air, sleeker, faster, freer, and that he smiled quietly, knowing the world had finally caught up to him. Others say he died before that, never knowing his legacy had taken flight. But perhaps that doesn't matter, because the sky remembers. Every daring maneuver, every break from the predictable, every pilot who trusts instinct over orders. That's his memory, alive and eternal. He may not have statues or parades, but in every screaming jet that slices through a sunlit horizon, his spirit flies again. He wasn't mad. He was a man who saw further than others dared to look, who understood that sometimes the path to victory runs through defiance. His story is not about rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's about vision, about courage in the face of authority, and belief in one's instincts when the world calls you insane. And so, his legend endures, not in medals or monuments, but in the hands of those who take the controls, feel the rush of altitude, and whisper to themselves before a dive, "Let's see what madness can do." As the sun melts into the horizon and the sky bleeds gold and red, the contrails of a dozen jets twist high above, patterns of smoke and fire tracing invisible art across the heavens. That's where he lives now. In every spiral, every risk, every impossible maneuver that redefines what's possible. A name the wind still remembers, a story the clouds still whisper, the legend of the mad pilot who broke the rules and taught the world how to fly.